I'm Gina Fitt, and you've either surfed to or purposely selected Live Talk with Bern Moses. Welcome to our show. Bern, the last couple of shows we've been talking about the book you're writing entitled Command Commission. And along that line we were talking about some ways that people can be in command of their lives. And we were going over some points at the end of our last show about how to recapture the authority and the initiative and esteem, I believe, to be more powerful in our lives.
Yeah, as I recall, I think we had hit the first two pretty heavily. One where we develop an attitude of gratitude. The other where we, what was the second one? Oh, a lot of completions in our lives. In order to do that, we have to have a lot of commitments in our lives. Now, back when we did strategizing, and certainly in the future as we touch upon it again, there will be a lot of emphasis on how to make those commitments effectively so that we can appreciate a lot of completions. Then I believe we'd progressed to the point where we were talking about that we must acknowledge and accept that at any given point in time, each of us is doing the very best we can based on our experience, our wherewithal up to that point.
And I think you mentioned that sometimes our very best is not very good.
Oh my goodness,
sometimes
yes.
is far from what others may consider to be adequate.
That's right. Particularly if people are not prepared to clear their life experiences as they go along, I think it's pretty common knowledge that we tend to collect and repress a lot of hurt, pain, upset, and agitation. And once in a while it'll explode. I mean, it comes out in totally inappropriate behavior.
Yes.
And when that occurs, of course, everybody stands and makes judgment, even though they're subject to the very same thing themselves. And it makes it difficult. And therefore there's a lot of generalization, a lot of prejudice, a lot of judgments being made in our society that perhaps are heavy-handed, heavy-hearted. They may not have to be as severe as that. I think I made a slight reference to a rather embarrassing moment in my life where I reacted, severely,
yes,
after 9 years of being cajoled and teased and mimicked and mocked from stuttering. And I don't want to delve into it, but I really attacked. In other words, that reptile came out in me, and I went into survival, and I tried to clear the decks. And I hadn't thought about doing anything like that before I did it, and immediately after this volatile, vicious act, I was in a state of remorse. And yet my whole life could have been dynamically affected by that if the parents of the person hadn't come to my stead. And I'll always be grateful for that, because there's no question what I did was severe enough. It was assault. And gosh, you can spend prison time for that. And then once you get into that environment, there's another dimension that's going on. As a matter of fact, we began to get into that. In fact, didn't I mention penal institution and problems?
I think you mentioned that on the next program we wanted to go into that.
Yeah, let's just move forward and, cover some of that. I know there's something amiss. And this is not to indict the process, but only to challenge us to examine it, perhaps. For example, in our community, we have an allegee. Someone, young man, young woman, someone, violates the normal order of things. They become an allegee. They become the accused.
Yes.
Perhaps they even spend some time behind bars while people await to try them. And then the trial comes, and of course you have a prosecuting attorney who, frankly, his job is to get a conviction. And in many cases go to extremes. They'll say or do anything in order to find the conviction. On the other hand, you have a defense counsel who will say or do anything to get the person free.
It becomes a battle of wits instead of an examination of what is true here.
Exactly. And oftentimes, and I know I've had the experience in my life with friends and acquaintances who we were trying to support, and you go there and you see this adversarial thing going on, and the accused doesn't recognize at all what really happened. It's not what occurred. And so it's very confusing. And then, of course, we have a place where we turn it over to a jury of peers that aren't.
Yeah.
Right. They're not peers. And they go aside, and then they come back, and they're asked if they've reached a verdict, and they say they have. And they say, what's the verdict? And we find the defendant guilty. Well, guilt always has been, always will be, a putrid poultice. A putrid poultice that can drive pain in to both parties. Now, you know what a poultice is. It's supposed to draw poison out.
Correct.
Okay? But can you imagine a wound on this arm and someone with a wound in their hand putting a putrid poultice on there? I mean, both people are going to be severely infected by it. And in one sense of the word, guilt is that way. For example, we find a defendant guilty, and so they send him to a place and treat him perhaps less than human. I know I have a young friend in Texas named Parker, delightful young man, married, children. He was found, this was a long time ago, with some marijuana in his car. In other words, it was one, I think, what do they call it, a joint or something. He spent a year in Huntsville State Prison for that and came out a totally different person. He had been raped and ravaged, abused, put upon, and he always had a sense of trauma about him. Notice his life never came back. In other words, I knew him perhaps as much as 12 to 13 years subsequent to that experience, and it was never the same. His family was impacted by it, and it was way out of proportion to the act. You know what I'm saying? But it was the law,
right,
you know?
Right.
And so, you know, you kind of get... What I'm saying is that perhaps someday, we could become sophisticated enough as a society where the scenario could go more this way. You have the alleged, the accused. You have a prosecuting attorney and a defense attorney, certainly, who are both seeking to find the real truth, what really, really happened. And then, of course, the information is turned over to a jury, perhaps, who returns, and when asked for a verdict, they say, we find the defendant unprepared. Unprepared. This is really more close to the truth, because typically we are unprepared to manage life's experience as it flows to us, and therefore we tend to react inappropriately, insensitively at times, and unacceptably, there's no question, but to be unprepared. And so the judge says you've been found unprepared, and so we're going to send you to the loving place. There's a place to go, and perhaps for the first time, okay, to be listened to be considered, to be loved, to be hugged, and maybe start all over again. That doesn't mean, for example, that that person is going to be excused for the act or that they ever may become free. But every person has an incredible capacity for good in them. Unless that has been so deeply stifled, perhaps that we have an unacceptable personality, and then the system has a way of handling that, I'm sure. All I know is that what we're doing is not working. It's not working. Now, I've mentioned some of this to people in the, the penal society, if you would, and some of them have responded emotionally to the idea, but say that it'll probably never happen because of our natural propensity for vindictiveness, for revenge, to want someone to pay the price for the pain that they've suffered. Even though they may subject someone else to pain themselves, or at least we're subject to doing so. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, I do.
I do know that this kind of thing does work. I've had too many people in my life who have circumstantially found a mentor, a coach, a counselor in the penal system and have come out, frankly, much better than they went in.
Well, it seems to me that at least a percentage of those people would be, as you say, found unprepared. And it seems like it's a crazy idea to put a bunch of people together who have nothing to learn from each other except for perhaps the negative things that they've done. Instead of putting them in an environment where they can be around people who are different than they are, where they can learn better coping skills, where they can, as you say, learn to love themselves and to love other people, that they're not going to grow and develop into the kind of human beings that can make a contribution in our society.
Key word, you put someone in a circumstance where they can make no contribution, and boy, you diminish the human spirit. We have to be able to do something that elevates. This is where we find ourselves. It's in that place of selflessness.
Yes.
And boy, if we can bring all this together sometime, perhaps we can get really sophisticated about this. This has to be accompanied too, of course, with one of the essential elements of agape love. You remember, it was weeks ago. In fact, just a moment. Did you realize that this was our 26th show?
Oh my.
Yeah, that's 6 months we've been together on the air.
That's wonderful.
Isn't that exciting?
It seems so much faster than that.
Doesn't it?
Yes.
I mean, it's been like this.
Absolutely.
But I don't know, somewhere back there, 12, 13, 14, something, we talked about the facets of love. kindness and patience and courtesy and what have you. And that, you remember we talked about the fact that no one could be as courteous as they might be, or as kind as they could be, or as patient as they might be, unless every day is accompanied with a certain amount of forgiveness. Now, this is where I want to spend most of the time this evening, on this one issue, forgiveness, because frankly, we've been misled about it, Gina, even lied to about it.
Really?
Let's go up here, forgiveness. Not very good at it as a society, frankly. And typically it's very difficult to follow the teaching of the masters on occasion. Forgiveness. For example, we've been lied to about that. What have we been told? We should forgive and what?
Forget.
Forget. And there is no erasure in the human mind. You're not going to forget the inappropriate behavior, the unkindness, the insensitivity. That's not going to happen. And so, you've heard people say, well, I'll forgive, but I'll never forget, which means certainly they haven't forgiven.
They haven't forgiven,
yeah.
yes.
Forgiveness. We've all had, there's not a person on the planet who hasn't had episodes in their lives that deserve this. And certainly so do they. This is a very private, personal thing. And frankly, as I say, we've been misdirected in this area. For example, I've been told that, hey, the past is past. It has nothing to do with the future, or need not have anything to do with the future. And I say, oh, yes, it does. It's part of who we are. I mean, you ever drive a car without a rear view mirror? You can get in trouble real quick. You know what I mean? In other words,
right.
With not being able to see behind you loses our sense of balance. And so, yes, it is important. And so they say today is the first day of the rest of your life. And everybody goes, oh, and I've always wondered what that meant. You know where I'm coming from as a praxeologist. Yeah, that's Pollyanna to me. And they said, well, just let it go. You ever hear that one? Just let it go.
Right.
Yeah, and there's a little voice out there, and all the people I've encountered that goes, how do you do that? How do you just let it go? And people say, well, I've kind of forgotten. Well, I contend that they haven't, unless they've really managed this well. What they've done is they've suppressed it. They've buried it under other hurt and pain and anguish and upset. And so this is what bubbles out occasionally, the old hurts. Now, I've read the books, and I've been to the seminars, and I've heard it all. And I mean, some of them have been really good, too. I remember some years ago, I went to a forgiveness seminar, and of course, it's not uncommon for them to do the hand raising, and those, I forgive. Just forgive. Just let it go. Or I forgive my mama, and I forgive my daddy, and I forgive my brother and sister. I forgive the world. You know what I mean? And it's wonderful. I mean, boy, it's touchy-feely, and you get goosebumps, and some people cry, and they hug, and what have you. But a few days later, you see the same hurt and pain bubbling up. It hasn't been managed.
And I think along with this issue of forgiveness, one of the most difficult areas for us to forgive is forgiving ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
and
no
as we
question.
were talking about being unprepared, I think at times people do things in their lives that they feel like permanently makes them less of a person
Yes.
than they want to be or than the people around them are.
And isn't that tragic?
And they tend to just give up and settle and say, I'm not who I thought I was. I'm not who I could be. And I'll never be able to overcome this. And that is a really sad place to be, because immediately we're giving up, again, our authority.
That's part of the wheelbarrow I'm talking about.
Yes.
We carry around this wheelbarrow loaded with stuff. Not only that's happened to us, but what we have initiated ourselves. And that's part of the barrier to our future. And that's what all of this is about, is to somehow clean that up so we can move forward. And so I wanted to continue with this, but go ahead. You had something else.
Well, and I just brought to mind the words of a popular song, objects in the rearview mirror may appear closer than they are. And I think that sometimes is for us. We look over our shoulders or in our rearview mirrors and we see what's going on or what went on in the past and feel like it's pursuing us at top speed and like we can never go fast enough to get away
Either that
from
or it flips right in front of us.
Right in front of us. And it's still there in front of us.
Yes.
So maybe we're going in reverse.
Yeah, it's tragic. It's tragic. They, I remember one time I went to a seminar too where I knew this was going to be a special one, because when we went in, there was this big cage filled with doves. Okay, and the bird of peace and whatever. And I thought, oh well, I know what they're going to do. And sure enough. Now they really weren't doves, by the way. They were pigeons, but they were white, so they called them doves. But anyway, later in the seminar, sure enough, they had us write down our hurt and pain and upsets on little slips of paper, and we rolled them up very carefully and put them in little plastic vials, attached them to the dove's feet, you know.
Right.
And there came that moment where they let him go, and flop, 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 you know what I mean? And it was, I mean, you talking about a satisfying moment. Gee, it was really touchy-feely. But the fact of the matter was they were homing pigeons. In other words, those hurts and pains came back. Now, the birds didn't, but I knew a lot of those people, and I saw in a week, in a month, the same reactionary behavior that comes from not having taken care of this.
So it was just a momentary emotional catharsis
Yeah,
for the
right,
people, but
right. Didn't
the
work.
underlying problems weren't resolved yet.
Exactly, exactly. How do you do this? So how do you forgive? Well, I remember years ago I had a whole stack of stuff. I'm not going to be too transparent on the air. In seminar, I'm very candid about things that occurred in my life that caused such pain, Gina, that I was suicidal. I didn't want to continue living if there was this much pain attached to it. But yet I still kept reading and thinking and wondering, and I'd pick up ideas here and there. I remember thinking that if they would just come and say, Bern, you got hurt, I did it, I'm sorry, forgive me, that I might be able to handle that, that I could forgive them on that basis. But they're not going to come. As a matter of fact, I believe with all my heart that if you take a third party and you go over there and you say, look, I mean, you really hurt old Bern, and what you need to do is to go to him and to fess up, say you're sorry, and ask his forgiveness. And that person would probably say, what? What for? What for? I don't understand. Because, see, whatever occurred at that point in time, they probably weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to keep from being hurt. See, I wasn't part of what was occurring. I just got absorbed in it. You
They
understand
were
what I'm saying?
protecting themselves.
Yeah.
Or
See, I know that's true. I've seen that happen so many times, and that's not going to work, okay? Or then again, I thought, well, gee, if I could just go to them, and say, look, I've been thinking about this and carrying a lot of hurt and pain and what have you. I'm going to just go ahead and forgive you, you know? I could get punched in the nose, I think. You know, in other words, I'll tell you how I know this. I have received 2 forgiveness letters in my life, and they were the most painful moments of my life.
really?
Yeah, because I did not understand. I mean, from my perception and my experience, I could not understand how they could possibly perceive what they had and had chosen to forgive me. It was really, really painful. It's a really fascinating thing. There's a lot of misunderstandings about this.
So you felt very misunderstood in those 2 instances.
Yeah. I mean, I had to go through, in fact, I'm still working on one where I'm going through the process of forgiving them for writing the forgiveness letter. I mean, it was that traumatic for me. Yeah, see, here's the thing. We got to get this straightened out because it's so incredibly important. Incredibly important. One thing we got to start with the fact that forgiveness does not mean that you excuse. I think we've tied that together so tightly. Like if I forgive someone of something, it doesn't mean I excuse them for that. But what is the forgiveness for? It's for my refreshment. It's for my self-rightingness. I must forgive. For example, the Pope went and forgave the young man who shot him. Do you remember that occasion when the Pope was shot? He went there and he held him and he comforted him and he whispered to him his love and his forgiveness. But the young man is still imprisoned.
Right.
And knows he's still accountable. I'm certain that Ronald Reagan forgave the young man who shot him, and yet he's still confined. You see what I'm saying? There is no reason, for example, in fact it's essential, that say, for example, a woman divorcing a man for infidelity, let's just say that's happening, she must forgive him for the infidelity. It doesn't mean she has to excuse him for it and to allow him to keep doing it to her over and over again. But the forgiveness must occur for her to ever be free. Otherwise, he keeps doing it to her the rest of her life.
Whether he's there or not.
Exactly.
Emotionally, she's
Exactly.
feeling the repercussions of that.
Exactly. So the process is one of self-cleansing, and the other person may benefit from it in some way. In fact, we'll talk about different case histories about the ramifications of this kind of thing. But it's terribly important to understand that to forgive is not to necessarily excuse. It could in some cases. I think within a family sometimes there has to be a forgiveness and a certain amount of excusing. But even then I think family takes liberties with that. and perhaps makes it even more difficult to really forgive because they keep doing the same thing over and over to you because they're family. And they can sharpen their teeth and their wits on you somehow. And I understand that that can happen. But we have to kind of work with this. How do we do this? How do we do it? I think it begins, well, I'm certain that it begins with the power of the Word itself. In other words, I've seen a lot of people hold a Bible up and we'll imagine the power's in the Word. You know what I mean? And I understand all that language and that feeling. But sometimes I feel that maybe what's really meant is that the power is in the word that's employed. You know the impact that semantics have that we've been delving into all these weeks? The power is in the word. For example, back in the 60s, I began to say, I forgive. And I didn't mean it. It hurt to say it. Stick in my craw, I forgive. But it got easier to say. There was some progress, certainly.
Did you feel differently? Or was it just
a little,
easier to say?
Not sufficiently free, but I felt a little different. I think just the word does help.
At least you had an intention to try.
Yeah, and I think that intention led me to a point of real understanding about this. I mean, a major, major breakthrough. It was in the 1960s, the early 70s, when I hit upon the correlation between forgiveness and the life formula. Now, you remember we've talked about the life formula in the past, and where we take all the functions of our entity out of the moment. In other words, the primary emotions, the primary functions, the primary postures and changes. Remember all that? And we go back to the time lifeline, and we know that at every moment of our life, a person is either in a love mode or a fear mode. And when they're in the love mode, they're contributing, responding to the world, making adjustments, and their libido is satisfied and they're healthy and happy. When they're in the fear mode, however, there is a tendency for them to fight, flee, or freeze. And we talked about how you can do all those things verbally, kinetically, or physically, and that how all of this leads to inappropriate behavior or, frankly, unacceptable behavior. It's when a person is in a fear mode, when they tend to do the things that hurt, that may even deserve punishment on a social level, is when they're in a fear mode. For example, this whole thing just came to fruition one day when I took that contract with Funeral Security Plans. Yes. It was a company years ago that I went to work for to sell pre-arrangements. And I visited a funeral home one day to get kind of a flavor for the product I was going to be selling. And I walked into a selection room. It was loaded with caskets, and we're going to be talking about this in the next few weeks. But I walked into the selection room, and it was about 3.5, maybe 4 seconds, and I collapsed. In other words, a wail came out of me, and I began to tremble, convulse. I got nauseous, my knees buckled, and they escorted me out of there, and they say, "What's wrong?" And I didn't know. I really didn't know. I knew the other people hadn't reacted that way, so it had to be something inside me. Well, in pondering and wondering about it, in a few days I began to recognize that it was the same thing that had happened 28 years before when I went into the reposing room when my father was lying to be viewed. The same exact symptoms. So I figured, something is working there. So I began to study bereavement, grief, and this type of thing. I began to realize that one of the major causes for bereavement, getting stuck in our lives, is unresolved issues. Okay, in other words, things that had not been addressed, not healed, incomplete
So we're kind of stuck in a loop, a feedback loop.
Exactly. And so I figured, maybe I better get to work on this. And so what I wanted to do is clear it up with my daddy. Now, he'd been dead 28 years. And so I began to realize what I had to do is to clean up our relationship so that I could really say goodbye to him. To do that, I had to forgive him. Now, he was not an abusive man, but he never had occasion to hug me or kiss me or touch me or pat my back or even on the head. He never confirmed me. He never said that he was unable to say that he loved me. I felt that he did. I know I adored him. You know what I mean? But there was this kind of a tenuous relationship between us. I was to be seen and not heard, you know, this type of thing. I remembered an event that had to be cleared up. I was 10 years old. Had to have been 1939 and thereabouts. No, it was during the war, as a matter of fact, 1942, 43. Mm-hmm. He was living in Massachusetts, and I was up in New Hampshire on the farm. And we've talked about the farm, I think, before.
Yes.
And while he was away for this 2-week period, I had built this doghouse. And I was very proud of it. And it was for my dog, Sugar. She was an Eskimo pup. And he would come up every couple of weeks, having saved up the gas coupons and made the drive. And we were always very excited for him to be coming. And this particular evening, I could see the fog lights coming up the mountain. We knew Daddy was coming. Finally, he pulled up into the yard, and I ran over and said, "Hi, Daddy," you know, and he didn't acknowledge me, and he seldom did. And I said, "Hi, Daddy," again, and finally he says, "Oh, hello, funny face." And I said, "I built a doghouse for Sugar while you were gone," and he didn't take note. A few minutes later, I said, "I built a doghouse for Sugar while you were gone," and he said, "Well, we better take a look at it." And so we walked over to the doghouse, which was under this big maple tree. He looked at it and laughed. He laughed at it, he laughed at me, and then he scolded me severely. And what we're going to do next week, okay, is to examine how that impacted my life and our relationship, and how I finally was able to get through it. This evening, this afternoon, this morning has gone much too quickly. And this is a fascinating subject, though, and it deserves some time. So this is show number 26, Gina. Number 26. 6 months going.
It's been wonderful.
Yes, and my name is Bern. And
Moses.
Thank you, Gina.
Thank you, Bern. We look forward to seeing you next
and
week.
If people want to call us, they can call 1-800-661-3490. Ask for number 26 and we'll send them a tape. Thank you.
Great.